Now will you turn with me to the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus. We have been tracing Moses' early life in our study of Exodus so far, as God carefully forms and molds his background, and then strives so patiently with him to make him the fruitful and obedient servant of God he later became. Now, the second half of chapter 3 of Exodus and the whole of chapter 4 are really a kind of dialogue between God and Moses, where God deals with all the difficulties and objections and weaknesses that Moses raises up to God as obstacles in the way of his becoming God's servant for this hour. And in so many ways, Moses is convicted that of all people, he would be the last to be the kind of man God is looking for in such a moment as this in the history of his people. And he actually pleads with God in chapter 4 at verse 13 to turn his attention to someone else. "O my Lord, send, I pray thee, some other person." And as God begins to unfold his plans to Moses, he has this sense of shrinking from the prospect of being such a man as God would deign to use. Now, of course, this is a passage which has a great deal to do with us this morning, when we are considering the great issue of what God's plans for our life may be, at whatever stage we may be at, whether young or old. One of the greatest issues is, what plans does God have for my life? And it is a glorious truth, not just to be learned by children, that the living God has a destiny for every single one of us here in church this morning. And the great issue is, am I ready to launch out obediently and believingly on the plans of God for my life? And let me say to you that applies at whatever stage your life may be. I sometimes think elderly people can imagine that issues like this are past and done for them, but not a bit of it. Moses was 80 when God sent him launching out on this stage of his life's journey. The crucial years of his life were still to come. And we need to grasp that God is continually confronting us with his plan and purpose for us, and saying to us, are you ready to launch out believingly and obediently on these bases? Well, we look this morning at how God patiently persuaded Moses that there was indeed no mistake, and that God meant to make a fruitful, useful servant out of him, however long it might take, however painful the process might be. There were basically 3 problems Moses had, you will notice, 3 objections which he raises to the very possibility that his life could be of any interest to God, far less use to him. And they were these problems. First of all, the problem of inferiority or inadequacy. In chapter 3, verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" The second is the problem of ignorance. Chapter 3, verse 13, "What shall I say to them," he says, "when they say to me, 'Who has sent you? What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" And the third is the problem of ineffectiveness. In chapter 4, verse 1, "Behold, they will not believe me," says Moses to God, "or listen to my voice. They will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" And it's repeated again in verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent either heretofore or since thou hast spoken to thy servant. I am slow of speech and of tongue. I am ineffective. And God begins to deal with each of these problems and objections that Moses raises in the pathway of serving God. Let's look at how God deals with them one by one. The problem of inferiority or inadequacy we have already touched on in a different connection. In chapter 3, verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" Now it's important to distinguish this sense of inferiority, this sense of inadequacy, which so often grips people at a time like this. It's important to distinguish it from a spirit of godly humility, which Scripture commends and God cultivates in our hearts. That spirit of godly humility equips a man to serve God. This spirit of inferiority and inadequacy can so often prevent a man from being of service to God and can paralyze him indeed with a sense of being of no fit use to God and His service. It arises from various things. It may have arisen for Moses from the source that it often has for us, and that is a paralyzing consciousness of past failure. And I have little doubt that that incident in Moses' past life when he attacked the Egyptian and slew him in a moment of temper, in a fit of rage which he hadn't controlled, I can imagine that that was something that pursued Moses through his life. And this consciousness of past failure is something which can make a man flee not only from Egypt, but from God and from the possibility of ever being useful to God again. And it's something that the devil will delight to draw us back to again and again and raise it up before us as the accuser and seek to paralyze us from serving God because of some incident. It may simply be some isolated thing in your past. Now, I don't know how many people, how many servants of God, how many Christian people who might have been of such great use and profit and benefit to the kingdom of God I have spoken to, who have been crippled by this kind of thing. And there may be overtones in this question of Moses to God. Who am I, he says, of all men to call upon? Who am I to serve God and go to Pharaoh with the authority of God? Now you see, this sense of inferiority has a characteristic which is seen here, and that is, it is not limiting ourselves. That's not the significance of it. The significance of it is that it limits God. And in this case, it is limiting His forgiving grace and His restoring mercy. It is putting bounds to the mercy of God, which is able to reach down to a man who has been a desolating failure and raise him up again, as He did David, to a place of glorious usefulness and leadership. And the problem about this crippling inferiority is that it can so often paralyze a man and limit God's grace. And it may be that there are some of us who secretly in our hearts have lived with this for a long time. And the thing that we are needing to allow God to say to us is that He is the restorer of those who have fallen. that he is the God whose grace is able to reach down to the infinite depths of our failure and bring us up again and set our feet on a rock and restore us to a place of usefulness. It may have arisen from this paralyzing consciousness of past failure. It may have arisen because of some deep awareness of a personal weakness or inadequacy. It seems that Moses did have some of these weaknesses. He had a weakness of personality, obviously, a weakness of temper. That was one area of his life where his personality was clearly weak. It seems also that he has had a weakness in terms of what we would think of as gifts. God speaks to him about this in chapter 4 from verse 10. But he says, I am not eloquent either heretofore or since thou hast spoken to thy servant. I am slow of speech and of tongue. He was not the kind of man who could speak convincingly. And for the task that God was calling him to, he felt this was what he needed. And he was inadequate in that area. Now, it's a very important thing for us to know our own weaknesses and to come to terms with our own inadequacies and not to imagine that we are different people from what we are by nature and by gift and by grace. But what Moses is limiting again, you see, is not himself, but God. And this is what God spells out to him in chapter 3, verse 12. He says, I will be with you. The important thing is not what you are or your weaknesses or your areas of personality that might be difficult for you. What is really important is what I can be to you, what I can make of you, what I can be in you. I will be with you, he says. And what God is assuring Moses of is this, you see, that no matter the inadequacies and the areas of weakness in his personality and makeup, if the presence of God is with a man, if there is this overwhelming consciousness that God is there with that man, then there is nothing else in the world that matters. And that's how God counters this sense of inferiority. I will be with you, he says. Now, really, that was what made Moses such a servant of God as he became. It was not natural gift or endowment. It was not that he had some great strength of personality or character. It was simply that God was with him. And that was the great characteristic of Moses' life all through his life and service. And he learned to covet that more than all else in the world, more than gifts and graces and powers which God gave him. He learned to covet above all else that God was with him. Do you remember the occasion later in Exodus in chapter 33? At verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, See, thou sayest to me, bring up this people, but thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found favor in thy sight, show me now thy ways, that I may know thee, and find favor in thy sight. Consider too that this nation is thy people. And God said to him, as he faced a new crisis in the history of the people of Israel, My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he said to him, If thy presence will not go with me, do not carry us up from here. What mattered to Moses more than anything else in the world, you see, was that the presence of God was a reality in his life and through his life to other people. Now, my friends, I believe that there is something here that is of increasing importance for us. There is probably nothing that matters so much as this, that the fragrance of the presence of God should be the supreme reality that people find in your life. And that's what God is seeking to do for Moses, to make him the kind of man who bears with him the glory and the presence of God wherever he went. And the reason that that was so important was that everything that he needed was found in God. That's what God is assuring him of as he says, my presence will go with you. I will be with you. Everything that he needed, every area where his inadequacy burdened him, God was sufficient for that. Now that's something that God confronts us with. I wonder if you really have laid hold on that truth. I remember Alec Motier, whose ministry many of you have been greatly blessed by at Keswick, saying to us at a meeting at Keswick on one occasion that he had been one Monday afternoon as a curate at a woman's meeting, not to speak but to listen to a lady who had come to speak to the ladies at this meeting, and he had been sent along by his vicar. And as he sat there, the lady got up and announced that she was going to be speaking on Exodus chapter 3, and particularly on verse 14, on the name of God, I am that I am. Now you may also know that Mr. Mateer is a very distinguished Old Testament scholar. And he sat back and said, now here I am going to learn what I've been waiting to learn for a very long time, what this name really means. And the ladies started to talk to these ladies from Wolverhampton about the phrase, I am that I am. And what she said was this. She said, it doesn't matter what problem or burden you have come into this meeting with this afternoon. It may be that you have a burden of illness. You may have a burden of weakness. You may have anxiety. You may have something. Now, she said, God comes to you and he says, what is your need this afternoon? Because I am that. I am. And the people in Keswick laughed and obviously thought it must have been quite a thing for the Old Testament scholar to listen to this poor woman making such a mess of what the name of God really meant. And as the laughter subsided, he said, now, if you won't tell anybody that I said it, she was absolutely right. Because that's exactly what the name does mean. Wherever there is a need, wherever there is an inadequacy in the lives of God's children, he comes and says, I am that, and I am that, and I am that, and I am that, and prove me and see whether I am not able to be that to you. What is the burden that you have this morning? What is the great sense of weakness that you carry into God's presence? Now what he says to you is, I am that you don't have. I am that. And I am with you. And my presence shall go with you. Now it's this, you see, that is the key to effectiveness in serving God. It's this that is the answer to our sense of inadequacy and inferiority. It's not to try to make ourselves different from what we are by nature. It is not to make the kind of personality that's shy and retiring, perhaps an ebullient and outgoing one. It's not to try to have the gifts that somebody else has and I don't have. It is to let God be God in your life. Beloved, are you ready for that? To let God be everything to you. The problem of ignorance. Moses cries to God in chapter 3, verse 13, "What shall I say to them? If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" Now the problem was that Moses felt he lacked instruction, you see. He wouldn't be able to answer their questions or deal with their difficulties. He was bringing to God this problem of his ignorance, and it wasn't an imaginary problem. It wasn't merely a matter of intellectual modesty. It was very real. And God answers this real need in Moses by two things. First, by revelation, and secondly, by instruction. He reveals his name to Moses, as we were considering last Sunday, and his character in the burning bush. And then he sets about instructing him. And for his problem of ignorance, God gives Moses revelation and instruction. In verses 14 and 15, the instruction is about God himself. "I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me. Say this to them. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name. Thus I am to be remembered." It is all instruction about God. Verses 16 to 18 are instruction about God's plans for his people. He begins to unfold to Moses what plans he has for his people to bring them out of Egypt. And verses 19 to 22 are instruction about the course of future events and how the people of Israel are to behave in the light of them. Now you will notice that God doesn't meet Moses' complaint about his ignorance by saying, "It doesn't matter," but by saying in chapter 4, verse 15, "I will teach you." This is the great theme of these verses. I will teach you. The answer to Moses' ignorance is God's instruction. The answer to Moses' inadequacy is God's sufficiency. The answer to Moses' ignorance is God's instruction. And God sets about teaching his servant. And over all these years, this is what he has been doing. He has been instructing him and teaching him. Now let me apply that truth, because God deals with our need to learn in the same way. He means to make us his instructed servants, and he deals with our ignorance by revelation and instruction. He has revealed himself through his Son by his word, and he delights to be our teacher and to instruct us in his ways. And that is what the Bible is for. And this is why God has given us his word, and this is where men and women become effective for God. When they are ready to submit themselves to instruction. Now, beloved, this is something we need to learn in our generation. We are far too ready to send people out into the service of God unprepared and uninstructed. And the fact that God is the sufficiency for his people does not mean that we go out to serve him in a way that he hasn't directed. And the way God has directed is that he puts his children under a course of solid instruction. And we become effective servants of God that way. So the apostolic church is distinguished by this, that they devoted themselves to the apostles' doctrine. They were instructed. And the reason that that was so important was that it was in this way that God communicated to Moses his ways, his wisdom, and above all, the knowledge of himself. And Moses became an effective servant of God by instruction. The problem of his inadequacy, the problem of his ignorance, and thirdly, the problem of his ineffectiveness Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say the Lord did not appear to you." It's the cry of the man who says, I could never really be of any use to God. Nothing would ever be accomplished through someone like me. And so God sets about reassuring Moses. And he does so by three rather strange little signs. But they are God's ways of encouraging Moses to believe him. First a rod, then a hand, and then a river. The rod in his hand. The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" Verse 2. And he said, "A rod." And he said, "Cast it on the ground." So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and take it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, has appeared to you. Now the rod may well have been Moses' staff, which he used in looking after his father-in-law's sheep. And it may be that what God is saying to him is, "What is this that you have? What is it that you have now?" Well, now he says, "Throw it down on the ground, lay it before me." And when what you have is laid before God and he commands you to take it up in his name, it will become the authority of God's rod in your hand. And that's what Moses experienced. Whatever you have, God says to him, cast it before God, and it will become a powerful thing when it's taken up at his bidding. And that rod became the symbol of God's authority. You will remember when Moses crossed the Red Sea, it was the rod of God that he held out over the water. When the rock was broken open and the water came gushing forth from it, it was the rod of God that touched it. And that rod became the symbol of God's authority. It often happens, you know, that with something that we may regard as being insignificant and ineffective for God, once it is laid down at his feet and then taken up at his bidding, it can become the symbol of God's authority and power in our service. The hand. This may refer to ineffectiveness with regard to his own inner heart and spirit. And most scholars seem to think that what God is teaching Moses here is something about the defilement of his own heart, which has become one of his greatest obstacles in serving God. So he says, put your hand into your bosom. And Moses puts his hand into his bosom. Now he says, feel the beat of your own heart. Feel everything that is there at the depths of your being, and bring your heart out, your hand out, and it was leprous. And he sees the defilement that there is in his own heart, but then God says, put your hand back in again. And when he takes it out, it is clean as the skin of a child. Now what's God saying to him? He is encouraging Moses to see and believe that there is cleansing, transforming power in the grace of God. That whatever Moses may feel about the ineffectiveness of his own resources or of his own inner being, God is able to change him and is able to make his defilement purity. And then the river. And that speaks of an ineffectiveness in the face of the opposition that he was going to face, because the river spoke of Egypt and of all the life of Egypt. The life of Egypt was said to be in the Nile, and the vast power of this mighty nation was represented in ancient terms by the river. Well, now says God to Moses, go to the Nile and draw water from it. Go to the very place which is the symbol of Egypt's life, and take their life-giving water and watch me turn it into death. And so the water of the Nile is turned into blood as a symbol to Moses that God is able to take all the power of Egypt and bring it to nothing. Now that's the answer to Moses' ineffectiveness. And it is all summed up in this, that God is able to take the weakest, poorest, most inadequate child of his and make him into a man of flaming fire for God. Now, my dear friends, you and I need to ask ourselves this morning, what about our sense of inadequacy and ignorance and ineffectiveness? God is able to take us, however weak and poor we may feel ourselves to be, however insignificant in the eyes of the world. The one thing that makes a man disqualified for serving God is not inadequacy, but unbelief. And Moses was learning in these days to obey and to go out trusting God in the most practical and in the deepest sense for every need he had. Are you ready to take your need in that way to him this morning and to say, whatever you mean me to be, Lord, by your grace, you can make me that. You can. Now let's sing together.